Today's guest is someone whose story has already changed lives. Tilly Rose is an author, advocate, and the founder of That Oxford Girl and That Patient Collective. Her story is extraordinary. She has spent 20 years trapped inside one of the most complex medical journeys imaginable. Repeatedly dismissed, misdiagnosed, and labelled as a medical mystery, Tilly experienced almost every corner of our healthcare system in her search for answers. Her conditions from Addison's disease and TB to EDS and severe vascular compressions created a domino effect that left her fighting symptoms affecting every symptom in her body. In 2022, after almost 3 months in a London hospital and on the brink of being discharged with no diagnosis and to comfort care, Tilly made a decision that would ultimately save her life. She posted her story online. Within hours, doctors, nurses, patients, and experts from around the world responded. That moment became the turning point that led to life-saving diagnosis and treatment in Germany. Tilly has since become a powerful voice for women in healthcare, working with the NHS Confederation and global medical organisations, writing about patient experience and building communities that help others feel seen, validated and supported. Her memoir, Be Patient, is a deeply human account of survival, misdiagnoses, humour and hope. And today, we're going to explore what it means to navigate years of uncertainty, reclaim your identity, and use your voice to transform not just your own life, but the lives of countless others. Tilly, welcome to Owning Space.
Thank you very much for having me.
Your story has resonated with so many people who have felt invisible or dismissed within the healthcare system. To begin with, can you share what life looked like before illness began to take over and how early symptoms first started to affect your everyday world?
Yes, so I actually had a very happy, healthy childhood, and it wasn't until I was 10 years old that I first began to become seriously ill. This began with a burst appendix and the same year then developing pneumonia for the first time. And I very much hoped that this was just this one-off kind of fluke experience. But sadly, that didn't end up being the case. And as you've said in your introduction, for the next 20 years, I became the ultimate medical mystery, doing the rounds of ologists, departments, doctors, hospitals. And I often say that as a result of this very long, drawn-out experience, seeing so many different sides of our healthcare system, that I really did end up becoming the expert that nobody wants to be, the expert patient.
You spoke about your burst appendix, and from, was it around the age of 10 to when you went to university?
Yeah.
Was there anything else dramatic within those years closer to uni, or did it kind of kick off then?
No, there was drama through that period, and as you say, it's a very difficult time to be struck down with symptoms that nobody can explain. I also was navigating this concept, which I hear from a lot of patients, of having what for the most part during that time was an invisible illness that makes it very difficult for people around you to understand. During that point in my life, I was also so desperate not to be labelled. I wanted to be known as Tilly, not Tilly the patient, and as a result was treading water behind the scenes, having to go to hospital appointments, having emergency procedures, navigating waiting rooms, wards, prescriptions, whilst also almost trying to live this double life with my friends at school, where I just wanted to be like everybody else. Yeah. And there was this kind of dual pressure that you were almost having to pretend and perform, which takes a lot of energy when you're seriously ill. That probably culminated around the age of 16 in an emergency bowel resection, which was extremely serious. Again, I was back to being this medical mystery where a chunk of my intestine had to be removed. It wasn't functioning, my terminal ileum. and nobody could explain why still. During that point in my journey, I was told, it was my GCSE year at school, I was told, don't bother taking your GCSEs, don't bother applying to university. But during this period, it was actually age 10 when I'd first become unwell with these symptoms. My parents, when I was recovering, had just taken me on what was a nice little day out to Oxford for a wander around the city. And I knew nothing about the university. My parents hadn't gone to university. But on this day out, we stumbled across a sign outside Balliol College, which is one of the University of Oxford colleges. And I'd walked into this quad in Balliol and just been totally in awe of what I'd seen. And I turned around to my parents and said, I'm going here, to which we all kind of laughed. What we didn't obviously know was what was coming for me over those next few years. And I continued to then be very seriously ill with repeated pneumonias, bowel problems, which obviously culminated in this resection, and a plethora of symptoms which were affecting my whole body. But throughout it all, I had this goal. And for me, that became everything during those years. In one way, you could say it was applying a pressure that you could say maybe I didn't need with so much going on. But I actually find that when you talk to patients, having a distraction and a goal outside of patient life, for me, proved so important because it meant that the patient part that I was so desperately not wanting to be a part of didn't then become my whole identity. I had this other goal that I was working towards. And very excitingly, I went on to read English literature and language at Jesus College, Oxford, which for me was an absolute dream come true. And after all those years of hell navigating the healthcare system, I really felt that at the end of it, there was this real sense of achievement, that I had something to show for those years when it would have been very easy to have given up and give into it. But I found during that time that studying was the one thing I could do from the bed. I could do it from the sofa. I could do it from the waiting room. I could do it from the ward. It became my focus and my positive during a really difficult time.
I think even that, I know we've just started the interview, but that in itself is such an inspirational part of your story, and we'll go on to talk about so many other inspirational things, and that's just one bit of the puzzle. And for you at 16, which is an age, I remember being 16 and I was like, I know everything about everything. And I was like, oh no. And then I got to like 35 and I was like, I know nothing. But at that age, it's such a, you're not in your formative years, but you're still learning, you're understanding what it's, you're mid, in the teenage life and things like that. So how did you find that when you spoke about having kind of a double personality?
Yeah.
When you were going through those years before you eventually went to Oxford, did you have a really good set of like friends? I know we'll speak about your family. Your family were your rock, particularly your mum.
Incredible, yeah.
How can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I've always been incredibly lucky with the support network that I've had around me. As you say, my family, as they've become known on Instagram, Team Tilly, have been with me throughout it all, and particularly my mum, which, as you say, we'll talk more about, I'm sure, later. Friendship-wise, it's a really difficult time to be navigating health issues during those teenage years. And because I was so desperate to have this kind of sense of normality and be like everybody else, I definitely kept a lot back from my friends during that period. There was a lot of trying to sort of do things behind closed doors. And that meant that it was hard for people around me to understand what I was going through because I wasn't being open and sharing those things. And it's been a real learning curve for me later on, where I did then begin to open up more, that I found that if you don't share that nitty gritty of what really is happening, how can you really expect people around you to feel what you're going through? And if you're not letting them in, they're not going to have that understanding. So I look back and think, could I have sort of dealt with that differently? But at the time, that was the coping mechanism that got me through. Yeah. And I was constantly talking to my mum about it. So I was getting it off my chest and I had that person that I could share it with. But I think what's interesting with the friendship side of things is that when you become ill for the first time, and I don't know if this is something you've experienced as well, but it's something that I find a lot of patients say, there's this like shock factor that comes with it, that you've had this terrible experience, everyone rallies around, and everyone's shocked by it. They're coming to the hospital, they're bringing gifts, they're sending cards, they're doing all the things you do when somebody's having a really rough time. But I use actually a story in Be Patient as an anecdote about this, about somebody at my school called Lottie Green. And Lottie Green was diagnosed with cancer when we were at primary school. And the first time that everybody heard this, it was so terribly shocking that this poor child was going through this, terrible situation in her family. And there was this really overt response where everyone was sending gifts and cards and balloons and talking about it at the school gates. But then when Lottie Green's life continued to be that, because she had ongoing health difficulties, ongoing treatment, it was then sort of a case of, oh, Lottie Green's back in hospital again. And it was that again that almost started to become a bit blasé, like it wasn't as bad now for her because she was used to it. And that was something that I found as the years went on, that the shock factor starts to sort of disappear in people's minds when you end up on this trajectory of being chronically ill where these things are happening on repeat. And sometimes the cards, the gifts, the texts, the kind of sympathy then begins to dwindle a bit because it just becomes part of who you are. And I think with that message, if you've got anyone in your life who's going through something like having a long-term or a chronic illness, I often use the analogy, imagine being stabbed with a needle once. That hurts. Nobody likes having that happen to them. But imagine being stabbed with a needle 100 times. That hurts even more. And if you sort of stop and think about that, it's no better the 20th time you end up in hospital. In many ways, it's worse. You know what to expect. You know the trauma that's coming for you. You are anticipating it before it happens. And fundamentally, you're having to go through it on repeat. And that is what I started to find in those teenage years, that it started to become a way of life that I had to adapt to, but almost by adapting and almost becoming so good at adapting to it, I wasn't really showing people how horrific that situation was. And not only for me, but for my family, it became this double life that we were having to navigate 24/7, and all the admin that comes with patient life, the time that people don't think about, and also the pressure it puts on the people around you as well and what they're going through. And I think in friendship terms, I look back at kind of how people not only responded to me, but also to my family. And I think it's a really, important point that if you've got either a patient in your life or the patient's family or their support network, it's also worth thinking like, who's looking after them? So like one of my mum's best friends, like her thing is she always fills my mum's freezer with her favourite apple cake. So if my mum's heading back from the hospital after, doing all-nighters in the chair with me, there's something that she can whip out and that makes her life easier. It's something she really loves. And sometimes it's just those small things that people can do that can make such a difference. Those like small acts of kindness. And I think the more that over the years I let my friends in, the more they were there for me in that way. And it became a learning curve for both of us, like both sides. And we both learnt a lot from that experience.
And, there's so many things I want to ask off the back of that and say, but fundamentally, you also figure out who your friends are and your tribe. Like I enjoy calling it a tribe and your community, which you've built on social media and in other places of your life, doing different conferences and things like that. But ultimately, you find out who, people say when you're growing up, you only need a handful of friends. And I remember being at school and I'm like, I want everyone to be my friend, but it's not realistic, really.
No,
You get the true friends. I also think, we speak about chronic conditions. It's so hard not having a diagnosis. So when you were 16 and before you did go to university, I'm sure what happened with doctors, like when you were going in for surgeries,
Yeah.
for bowel surgery. What kind of things did they tell you?
Well, yeah, as you say, I was having this kind of plethora of symptoms that were affecting so many systems in my body. And our healthcare system, it really became apparent, isn't set up for that multi-system approach. I use the phrase in Be Patient that I was passed from ologist to ologist like a hot potato. And it was very much a case of the doctor who was focusing on my head had no concept of what was going down on my feet. And I say it's almost like the photograph of my body was cut into horizontal strips and everyone had their separate piece, but nobody was joining the dots together. And as a result, nobody was taking ownership of you. So you were just quickly passed from pillar to post, but without a label, without a diagnosis, there was no pathway to follow. And I think that's something that patients with rare and undiagnosed conditions really struggle with, that there isn't a set pathway within our system to know what the next step is. And as a result, they're not only not getting the diagnosis, but often they're not actually getting the support with the symptoms themselves. And the day-to-day management of their case then ends up being very much down to themselves, their advocates or their support network around them. And during those years, I was suffering from repeated pneumonias. I ended up having the emergency bowel resection. I was having symptoms that were affecting my skin, my sleep, my heart, all different areas of my body. And logically, my mum and I just felt I couldn't have this many separate things wrong with me. Like, these symptoms had come at once. There must have been some overarching reason how I'd gone from this happy, healthy child to suddenly being struck down with all of these chronic symptoms. And whilst the different labels came over the years, it just didn't feel like anyone was bringing the whole picture together. At the end of that, that kind of part of my journey, whilst I was at university, I found out that I'd actually been living with 13 years of undiagnosed tuberculosis, which had stemmed from drinking unpasteurized milk on my great aunt's dairy farm when I was 5 years old. And it was kind of this crazy story that everybody kind of thought everybody else would have looked into something like that with the symptoms I was displaying. But this very nature of kind of being passed around the system meant that actually some of the fundamental tests hadn't been done. And whilst that sadly didn't end up being the end of my journey, it was a pivotal point in my journey which connected to lots of the subsequent diagnoses. And fundamentally, it was the weight loss that stemmed from the TB that triggered a lot of the health problems that I went on to have in the future. And in that sense, my story sort of seems extreme and unique, but actually it was, as we'll discuss probably as we go on, it was something that could have happened to anyone. And it showed me that this kind of life of being a patient is something that none of us know whether or not that's going to be around the corner. And fundamentally, we are all patients at some point in our lives.
Of course, yeah.
And this journey that I've been on has been a long one and such a roller coaster. But I have now heard so many other people's stories. And like we've spoken about your story, and when I meet people, everyone has a tale to tell, whether it's the fact that they've been to the GP once or they've had a loved one who's been in the system. It's going to touch all of us. And as the years went on, it made me more and more determined and passionate to change patient care, because I continued to see so many things that I say I can't unsee.
And you're doing it, and honestly, you're such an inspiration to me, and I know you're following. Can you bring us back to that diagnosis of TB? Because I know that you had some smaller diagnoses before that point, but nothing was concrete, and that's a huge diagnosis.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to ask off the back of that is, within that story, shout out to Tilly's mum, who has always supported you, but very much so within that diagnosis, she realised something wasn't right. Yeah. And if it wasn't for your mother pushing this, speaking to the right people, emailing the right research kind of bodies, your story would have been far different. So please, Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, my mum has been so pivotal in this whole journey. And as you say, well, without her, I wouldn't still be here now. There's no doubt about that. And that was just one example of how her role manifested during this time. But yeah, during the tuberculosis diagnosis, that fundamentally came about when, as has happened on many points in the journey, I was being told that all the tests had been done. They were not going to be looking into my case anymore. And my mum basically pushed to say, well, I've got ideas for more tests. My mum's view had always been, with the medical staff and the doctors in particular, that she needed the knowledge and she needed to have done the research in order to be able to ask the next question. So rather than just putting out there, oh, my daughter's really ill, can you help her? She felt, to have those specific scientific questions that she could pose that almost couldn't be argued with, that the evidence and the science was there. So she would spend night after night up until 4 a.m. trawling the internet. And around the TB diagnosis, she eventually asked if she could bring her research papers and present them to the doctor, who very reluctantly agreed, I think thinking she was going to turn up with, a bit of paper. And she rocked up on the ward with a suitcase full of ideas for tests.
My God.
Yeah. And I think they were a little bit shocked, but that ended up being the catalyst that meant my case was taken to a proper team meeting where it was actually discussed. Again, another problem with our system is that often there's not communication between and across teams. But this led to my case being discussed at a meeting, and actually a more junior doctor coming up with the idea of doing this tuberculosis test, which then became quite convoluted because there were different ways of treating TB. And yeah, as you say, my mum, her research had led her to believe that I needed to be treated for active TB because I was displaying active symptoms. A very controversial debate ensued amongst the medics about which treatment they were going to give me. But my mum fundamentally ended up being right. And yeah, it was a mad story where she ended up contacting the test manufacturer in the US to clarify her understanding from her research. And this led me to my life-changing diagnosis, my life-changing treatment, and for a period of time, getting my life back and transforming, which was incredible.
Yeah.
I owe my mum my life, but she has constantly felt that being able to have that knowledge is power. And as a patient, often that power balance between the medic and the patient can be a real disparate situation where you're the vulnerable patient in the bed and you need that advocate who can speak on your behalf when you're not able to do so. And I've been so lucky to have my mum throughout that journey.
And I think, there's a certain level of your mum having a gut feeling, knowing that things weren't right.
Yeah.
And fighting for that that advocacy.
Yeah.
You speak on, I think it was at one of your previous podcasts, and you say that it's kind of like playing a game when you're with doctors in some ways.
Yeah.
Because, and I've experienced this, like I have to be careful sometimes of how much research I feel like I've done.
Yeah.
And I've had some male doctors, and this isn't a male doctor thing, 'cause female doctors as well, but I've just got examples with male doctors who have gone, oh, so you think it's this? Oh, do you? Do you think it's that? And it's kind of like they're, it's such a horrible form of gaslighting and kind of taking the piss. But I'm just like, no, because this is the centre of my life right now, not for you. I'm trying to support. So how do you feel about that now from everything that you've been through? And I'm, very aware that we've only started with your story. But when you're speaking to doctors now, do you think there's a certain part of you that you still mask or you keep back?
I think the role of the patient, and as we say, the expert patient, is something that we have grown into over the years. We've obviously learnt so much as these years have gone by. But I do say that in many situations, it has felt like you have to play the game. And the concept of like Google doctors, which you end up being referred to as a patient when you're doing all this research, comes with a feeling that if you are to step on toes or appear too knowledgeable or in any way kind of annoy the doctor who is in charge of your care, there is a very difficult power balance there, which you're very aware of. You know that fundamentally, in some of these situations, your life is quite literally in their hands. And they can make that decision on whether to do the next test, whether to discharge you. And it's something that is fundamentally wrong. But we did end up playing a game. So we would do all our research. We would make sure that we felt like we had all our evidence. But then we would have to be very careful in how we posed those questions to the doctors. And often our way of doing it was posing them as questions, as logical questions that were very well researched, that hopefully we were always just trying to kind of, I guess, prick their thinking and hoping that maybe if we could do that, it would allow us to have another option rather than the door being closed. But what was sad was that you didn't always kind of get that response that I think from the outside people might expect that you would get. Yeah. And as the years went by and I ended up with further symptoms that didn't make sense, that didn't fit the textbook, I found that there was a real shift in how the doctors spoke to you. When you had a very clear label and a very clear diagnosis, they had a very clear pathway to follow. But when you didn't, it almost started to feel in some situations like you were in some way to blame. And I used to think, isn't it worse that you're dealing with these horrific symptoms that nobody can explain, therefore nobody can help you with? But rather than evoking more sympathy, it actually seemed to evoke a lot less. And that was where, sadly, and I've heard from so many women, which is, as you're touching on, there was often then a shift to, if we can't find a physical reason as to why this is happening to you, there wasn't the thought process that maybe we haven't just done the right tests, because look how many tests are out there. They couldn't possibly have done them all. There was a shift to, oh, maybe this is all in your head. Yeah. And that was a jump that I think massively needs to change within our healthcare system. And I say that I never blame any doctor for not finding it, for not giving me my diagnosis. My case was complex, and the same goes for so many other patients. But I did blame them for the way that they started to speak to me, because there's no reason to not be kind to anybody, but particularly to somebody who was going through such a tough time. And that was the bit that, I found really, really unforgivable.
Did you ever feel that medical professionals thought that you were making things up or exaggerating?
I think what would happen was this kind of shift from day one, where it felt they were taking your case very seriously. And a good example of that for me was probably later, when my health reached a crescendo, in which you mentioned in your introduction, in 2022, when I was in this London hospital. And I was in that hospital for almost 3 months. And when I first arrived there, there were doctors who were coming, and they were quite literally crying at my bedside as I was having these seizure-like convulsions that were happening every few hours. Again, multiple parts of my body were being affected. I had swellings all over my head. I had rashes coming up my feet that were burning and absolutely, raging, disgusting to look at. I had very visible physical symptoms, but nobody could explain them. And I had these rising lactate levels, which, if any medics are listening, will understand, of up to 11, which were life-threatening lactate levels. I was told I should be dead. So there was this fear surrounding what was going on with me at the beginning. And I had doctors saying, we're going to do so many tests, we're going to solve this. This really positive attitude that we were like all in this together. But as that admission progressed and more tests were done and they couldn't find the cause, there was this shift from tears at the bedside to doctors beginning to use the language perceived inability to walk, perceived paralysis. Wow. And I remember picking up on that word perceived and again questioning the logic, saying, how can this be perceived when it's so overtly visible? I'm telling you that my feet are burning. Look at them. Yeah. And on my Instagram, you can see the photos of me in that hospital. What was going on with my skin? It was awful. It was so so overtly visible. And I'm telling you that I can't walk, and look at my legs. And I'd be lying in the bed and they'd visibly be contracting and shaking without me moving them involuntary. So I think my evidence was that this was visibly happening to me, and you kind of couldn't believe that this shift was taking place. And then, as again, I've heard from so many, particularly female patients, they then sent in psychiatry when they couldn't find the answer. And that just seemed, mind-blowing to me that we'd had this jump. Thankfully for me, the psychiatric assessment said that mentally there was nothing that was causing these symptoms. They were very physical and they just hadn't found them. But you're in such a vulnerable position. You're having that psychiatric assessment. I was having it in the blue box, as I called it, that I was living in, on an open ward. We're surrounded by other patients that could hear everything that you were saying, living in what were these absolutely horrific conditions where I had bedpans piling up around my bed that were never cleaned. I had a window blind that for months on end never opened. I had patients climbing into my bed in the middle of the night. I had patients dying in the beds next to me. Yeah. And what does that do to somebody? And then you've got a psychiatrist asking you about your mental health. And I remember saying, I think I'm having a very normal response to a very traumatic situation. Look around you, like who would be happy living this life? Yeah. But that is very different from the cause of my symptoms being stress, being in my head. And I think that's the fine line. And I think the really awful thing is that in some of those situations, you could end up being kind of boxed into being told that was in your head, when actually an organic cause, a physical cause was out there that still wasn't being searched for. And I've heard stories, so many stories of patients who have had that.
I mean, doctors like boxes, right? They like the protocol because that's what they've studied, that's what and it confuses them if they can't solve this new, as you've called yourself, the medical marvel. Yeah. So Tilly, you got diagnosed with tuberculosis at university.
Yes.
Can you talk us through what happened from that point?
Yeah, so after that, I very much thought, this is it, I'm going to get my life back. And for a period I did. But then sadly, once again, started to develop this sort of list of nondescript symptoms, which, once again, nobody could understand and explain. And I ended up finding that I was going back to the doctors saying something wasn't right. And sadly was, again, being told that the test results were normal. They didn't know why. And was sent to a psychologist at this point. Right. So I sat in front of this psychologist, explaining all of these very physical symptoms I was having, that something wasn't right in my body, I was certain of. She responded by telling me that I needed to adapt to life as a well person.
Wow.
I was saying, I don't feel well. I can't physically get out of bed every morning. I'm vomiting every morning. Doctors were saying that I needed to be more motivated. I needed to get up. I needed to start moving. So I'd always been somebody who would do anything to try and help myself. So I was forcing myself out of bed every morning, walking around the block, coming back, throwing up, thinking this can't be right. And 2 weeks after being told by the psychologist to adapt to life as a well person, I went into my first adrenal crisis, which is where your adrenal glands don't produce cortisol, which is your stress hormone, which all the organs in the body need to live. Adrenal crisis, if it's not treated, ultimately leads to a coma and death. So it's very, very serious. You have to carry around a life-saving emergency injection, wear a medical alert wristband for the rest of your life, take steroid medication for the rest of your life. So it was a life-changing diagnosis again. But I was told that if I took my steroids, I should be able to live a relatively normal life.
Right.
Unfortunately for me, that didn't happen.
Okay. And then, so that was, and this was all whilst you were at university?
This was after university.
Okay. And were you in hospital every day at that point, or were you going back and from?
Back and forth.
Yeah.
When I went into my crisis, you have to spend time as an inpatient, being pumped full of steroids. And these adrenal crises for me became more and more frequent, where it was becoming in and out of hospital all the time, requiring emergency meds. So again, hospital patient life was becoming a big part of my life again.
I want to talk to you about something specific which is in your book. Firstly, a shout out to your patient survival tips, because that's really helped me. Obviously, I know that we've spoken the other day about I've had my own medical journey, and my followers will know as well, but the patient survival tips that you have in your book at the end of each chapter really can relate to anyone who's going through hospital visits or any kind of misdiagnoses. So thank you so much for that, because I'm going to get my highlighter out and look at them all the time. One thing that you did say in your book, and it's a doctor who said to you that they needed the bed, or the bed that you were on, for a different patient, and they were going to discharge you to comfort care. I know there was a pivotal moment, which was in 2022. Can you speak to us about what happened in that moment?
Yeah, so after I received this Addison's diagnosis, I then obviously, as I explained, didn't manage to get this steroid. The steroid didn't change my life. It didn't manage to get my symptoms under control. As the years went by, things continued to deteriorate. And this reached a crescendo in the summer of 2022, where I was admitted to a London hospital, for almost 3 months. I arrived at that hospital in a really, really terrible state. I was having, again, extreme symptoms that were affecting every part of my body, seizure-like convulsions every few hours that nobody could explain. I started that admission in a desperate state, but full of hope that I'd found a medical team who were going to do lots of tests and were going to try to help me. But as that admission progressed, it became apparent, as was this pattern that I'd witnessed in our medical system, that I wasn't fitting the textbook. And as a result, the care, the interest in my case began to dwindle as time went by. And that then culminated in, as you say, this night that I will never forget for the rest of my life, where I was told that all the tests had been done and that I was about to be discharged on comfort palliative care. That was a moment in my journey where all of this hope that we'd held on to for so long suddenly felt like it had all been snatched away. But my mum and my family couldn't get their heads around the idea that you could discharge somebody on palliative care when you didn't know what was wrong with them. A diagnosis hadn't been made. I'd been told I had these life-threatening lactate levels. I had these overtly visible symptoms that were going to be impossible to manage at home. And in that moment, out of sheer desperation, I decided that I had nothing to lose by sharing my story, sharing my symptoms on my Instagram at that Tilly Rose, and asking if the world had any ideas. And it turned out they did. The world answered. This post ended up reaching people from all corners of the globe, professors, PhD students, patients, their families, got in touch with test suggestions, diagnosis ideas, and treatment options. And my mum, who had really been like my medical detective through this whole period, she compiled all of these ideas into this master list. And she spent the next year researching every single one. There was one idea that she kept returning to, and it didn't quite fit with all of my symptoms, but it did fit with a lot of them. And this, to cut a very long story short, ended up with, in November 23, us boarding a plane to Germany to have a very specialist scan that she'd read about in her research papers. And that was the moment that I received my life-saving, life-changing diagnosis of what turned out to be multiple vascular compressions, which meant that the major blood vessels in my body had become squashed and blood wasn't flowing to vital organs. And it fundamentally turned out that this was caused by underlying Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. That meant that as well as my body being bendy on the outside, it was also bendy on the inside and had led for veins and organs to shift into the wrong places, hence causing this major problem with blood flow, which had sadly been missed on my scans in the UK, was identified in Germany, and led to me going on to have major open abdominal surgery, which saved my life.
That's incredible. And that was...
Instagram saved my life. Instagram and my mum.
You've explained to us that eventually you did get diagnosed with several conditions, which must have been so overwhelming for you. But can you tell us in which order, chronologically, they all kind of appeared or they were diagnosed?
Yeah, so my story from the outside can sound quite complex in the sense that I had all these different labels applied to me over the years, but actually I describe it as the perfectly imperfect storm because it was ultimately a domino effect where everything ended up connecting. But it wasn't until much later in my story, when the medical mystery was solved, that all the pieces of the puzzle were put together. So originally I was diagnosed with the tuberculosis, and that meant that at age 14 I lost a significant amount of weight. And for me, that was caused by TB. For someone else, it could have been a different reason. There is then a direct correlation between tuberculosis and Addison's disease, where my adrenal glands started to fail. And then ultimately later, I got this diagnosis of vascular compressions after the London hospital admission in Germany. And at that same time, I found out that underlying hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome can cause you to be not only bendy and flexible on the outside of your body, but also on the inside. And if somebody with EDS loses a significant amount of weight at a time in their life when their body's changing anyway, like at puberty, hence me with the TB, veins and organs can end up shifting into the wrong places. And this ultimately is what happened to me. I lost this significant amount of weight. Things moved into the wrong places, which went undetected for years and was also disrupting blood flow to major organs like my adrenal glands. So it was this sort of knock-on effect that actually all culminated in being underpinned by Ehlers-Danlos, but had maybe one part of the story not happened as it unfolded, the trajectory might have been quite different.
And was that, just to be crystal clear with the timeline, was the EDS diagnosis pre-Germany or was that during Germany?
So EDS was something that when I was a teenager had been mentioned at a one-off appointment. I was about 15 and I was told that I had this hypermobile EDS. But it was explained to me basically just like, you're a bit bendy, and my mum's quite bendy, and there was no explanation that it was responsible for my symptoms. It was only much later in Germany where the German medics that I was under have made these quite cutting-edge revolutionary papers into how EDS can actually cause the vascular compressions themselves and a whole host of other symptoms, conditions that I've now met so many women who are being told they've got MCAS, POTS, gastroparesis, all of these different what are ultimately symptoms that are actually explained by a condition that, as you know, people are really struggling to get a diagnosis for. So it all came together with my German medical detectives piecing back my medical history and actually seeing that there was this really clear link between all of these. And as I always said, I can't have this many separate things wrong with me. There's got to be a connection. And there was.
In a certain way, do you feel validated since when you did get those concrete diagnoses? Do you feel, was it more overwhelming or less overwhelming when you finally got the diagnosis?
Oh, when I went to Leipzig and had this life-changing scan that detected the compressions and the professor said that he could explain why these symptoms were happening to me, it's no word of a lie, quite literally had this involuntary scream when he found it on the scan, because the sense of relief when you are that ill and nobody is offering to help you, nobody knows what's happening, to finally have an explanation, I knew finally meant I was going to get some help. And the relief overpowered any other emotion at that point in time.
Because there's a protocol.
Yeah, suddenly there was a pathway available to me, and it felt like there was hope for the first time in a really long time.
Your following on Instagram now is outstanding, because you've grown that out organically. And I've seen the comments and the reactions that you get. And I think there's so much validation in the sense of your story. No one should have to go through what you did. And it's so complex. There's so many layers to it. But it also shows that it's not extraordinary in the sense of other people have likely gone through similar things or being misdiagnosed, but we need to talk about it.
100%. I've completely seen, as you say, that social media gets a bad rep. But I say my platform has ended up showing me social media for social good.
Yeah.
It 100% restored our faith in human beings, that these perfect strangers on the internet were willing to give up their time to think, research, share ideas with us. That was incredible and life-changing. But it also showed me that social media has the power to open up healthcare conversations on this global scale. And as you say, my story might seem unique, might seem extreme, but when I started to share it, and I share it in chapters, so I write chapters as my Instagram captions, and it was almost like turning this horror story, but also a story of love, hope, heartwarming, heartbreaking moments, the daily reality of being a patient. I started sharing in chapters that became like this storybook that was unfolding. And I say I was writing it as the writer, the author, the narrator, but I didn't know the ending. But I forever manifested that it was going to be a happy one. And what I found was that I was validating other people's daily reality. So as you say, all of these patients and their families were getting in touch and saying, this is the part of my life that other people don't see. And I was showing these quite visceral images, these raw moments behind the hospital curtain. But I was also intertwining it with these heartwarming moments with Team Tilly, my mum, my dad, my auntie, my boyfriend, where there was this image of love around the hospital bed and showing how much that meant. There were moments of hope where I was sharing that we had these interactions with staff members. It was bringing the human side of the healthcare system in. And it was the idea that, you know, we were living in this hospital, and in the London hospital, it was in many ways, you know, this traumatic horror scene. But within that, there was the maverick doctor who wanted to help me and stayed late after work to research my case. And the system was blocking him, but he had this brain and this heart that wanted to try and solve it. Or it was the cleaner, Mrs. Sharma, who every day made my mum a cup of tea. And by sharing those little moments, so many other patients and staff were getting in touch and saying, do you know what? It's so important as a staff member to know how much that means to somebody who's in the hospital bed. Or a patient then sharing their story about the nurse that they remembered who, I don't know, bought them a cupcake the day that they were having this terrible day, and how those little moments meant so much during those tough times. So it was this human element that was being shared. But also, as a result of sharing it, I think it became, and it's become, empowering for patients who are now getting in touch to say that as a result of following my page or reading Be Patient, they've gone on to receive their own life-saving, life-changing diagnoses. And when we were in Germany, my mum and we were there in the end for over 18 months. And we met people from all over the world who were flying to this very specialist clinic for this vascular compression operation that they weren't being offered in their own countries. And we met so many, particularly mothers and daughters, because this was a condition that fundamentally, or a lot of the time, affected young women. It opened our eyes to the fact that we'd had this battle for years as a mother and daughter pair, of this battle to be believed, diagnosed, and then treated along the way. But it became clear, and it's become clear from the Instagram, that we were so not alone on this journey. And we met young women who, for instance, there was one girl from New Zealand who she was self-catheterizing over 30 times a day and being told by doctors in her own country that she was refusing to urinate.
That's
Stories
crazy.
like this that you hear, and you're like, that's not even possible. How do you even stop yourself urinating? Or girls that were being told they had eating disorders who actually had a condition called MALS, which was a vascular compression that was physically stopping them from eating. And I saw these girls in the hospital who had their operation, and a few days later, they were there stuffing in a burger and chips. They didn't have an eating disorder. They had a physical reason as to why they couldn't eat.
Yeah.
And to hear that some of these girls, women, had got their diagnosis as a result of following my journey, researching their symptoms, looking into their case, it showed me that patients supporting patients is the way forward, and that actually social media does have the capacity to change lives in this way. And I think it's a model that could be replicated on a much bigger scale.
Absolutely. And it's just what you're doing. And I just think the incredible purpose that you're leading with your life, it's so commendable. So I know I've said it before, but it's just, I found your story so inspiring. I want to just quickly talk about the Maverick. And I just think, he was incredible. And I think within your story, within your book, you are a bit shocked because you kind of doubt it, you know. At some points you're like, how is he,
so invested?
And you give I think it's either your auntie or your mother, and you're saying to them, like, is this for real?
The Maverick was such a surprise for us because it wasn't what I was used to, that somebody was actually thinking about my case holistically and looking at all the different parts of it. But as you say, was being blocked by a system that actually didn't allow that to happen. So he wanted me to be moved to his ward, but I didn't fit under the infectious disease bracket that allowed me to do that. He had ideas for and wanted to run more tests, but actually the system says, if this test hasn't come back positive, then we're actually not allowed to do the next test. So it really showed a problem with our system. And at that point in my journey, I was on the ward of AMU, which is effectively an extension of A&E, where you're meant to really just be there for three days max. Before, as you say, if you have your cardiology problem, you go onto the cardiology ward. But because they couldn't put me in any of the boxes, I just ended up living in what I said was this no man's land of AMU, where nobody would take ownership, but therefore my case was never progressing because, as you've clearly experienced, there was no continuity of care. There was a different consultant arriving on that ward every Monday. By the end of my stay, they had 60 days of case notes to read. It was never going to happen. So you were kind of, you knew that it wasn't going to be solved in that scenario because the time and the system wasn't going to allow it. For us as a family, over the years, in terms of how we navigated that, we'd learned that ultimately this is your life and no one is going to be as invested in that life as you or the people who love you and your advocates who are around you. So in terms of taking control, our only way of taking control was, as you say, being able to ask those questions, being able to pose those test ideas. And my mum, very strongly believed that that was the only way that we would move things forward. So our way of coping and dealing with it was, my mum would always say we needed a short-term plan and a long-term plan. The short-term plan might have been writing the list of questions that we would ask the doctor the next morning. The longer-term plan might have been, right, what ologist do we think we need to see when I'm discharged from this hospital, and how can we find them? Having a plan meant that even when things felt really futile, I always felt like I was moving forward. But saying that, as you say, the system that I was trapped in as an inpatient meant that a lot of that control was taken away from you. And nothing perhaps showed that more viscerally to me than a really, really tragic story that will stay with me forever of the lady in the next bed. And it's a story I share in Be Patient. She was called Lena. And like me, Lena was a patient on AMU. She had cancer. and the cancer was affecting 2 parts of her body. But Lena was told that they needed to identify what the primary cancer was in order to start treating her. Lena's family, like my own, were at the bedside researching, posing questions, loving her, caring for her, doing everything they could to support her. What really screamed out at me about Lena's situation was they did know what was wrong with her. They knew she had cancer, something that, as we know, affects so many people. And yet we were back to this situation where her body was, they were trying to put her body in a box, and it didn't quite fit because they couldn't work out which was the primary cancer. Rather than just thinking, do you know what, let's just get the hell on here and treat her, they were then paralysed by this indecision that didn't fit the system, and Lena didn't end up getting treated. And for the time that I was on AMU, she lay next to me for 6 weeks, quite literally withering away in front of our very eyes, and really tragically ended up passing away. And for me, that story still drives me in what I'm doing today, because it showed this fundamental systemic problem that her life did not need to end up that way. And it was purely because of a system that wasn't creating a pathway that allowed for flexibility in any sense of the word. And she had the same problems in terms of continuity of care, ownership. And I think that's a really important point to make, because some of these diagnoses you hear about, you can think, do you know what, that wouldn't happen to me. But I think we've all, in some capacity, whether it be ourselves or our loved ones, been touched by cancer in our lives. And it really just opened my eyes to the fact that that situation we could have all been Lena. And yeah, that's massively driven me moving forward, because it was heartbreaking, and a story that my family and myself will just, that will never leave us.
I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. And I know she was the one who had a lovely daughter who had researched,
really
similar
loving
to your mother, researching every day.
Her daughter was doing everything she possibly could, and yet again was blocked by this system that wasn't set up for somebody like her mum, and that was just dreadful.
And I think what's really astonishing with that is cancer has a protocol. Like, cancer is, everyone knows about cancer, things like EDS, yes, okay, some people might not have heard of.
Yeah, you feel they're more rare diagnoses that maybe don't have that pathway set up.
And it's invisible, as we've spoken about. And I do want to speak about zebras in a second. But with her story, I mean, it makes me think about when they wanted to discharge you to comfort care, to palliative care.
Yeah.
For how you've said very openly, like, they didn't do all the tests.
No.
And to do that to a woman who, I think you were just under 30 at that point.
Yeah.
It's incredibly just, I can't even fathom it, actually. I actually can't get the words out on how someone could even think about doing that. And it comes down to accountability. No one's taking ownership of that case. And I know things change for the better, which is incredible. Yeah. And that's why your book is such a story of hope and advocacy. That's how I'd kind of summarize it. And so many different things, but there's so much hope in your book. But for them to discharge you, someone so young, and have not thoroughly done all the tests that they could have, which was in their remit, I'm sure, it makes me so sad. I would love to talk about your book now, your memoir, Be Patient. It's incredible. And as I've said, I've listened to it on Audible. I've got it on hardback now, because I'm hoping that I can have a little signing from you.
Of course.
The Tilly Rose after this. When did you start writing your book? Because I know that you spoke about manifestation earlier, which I'm all about, and I think that's incredible. And it kind of makes me think about when you went to Oxford with your parents and you were like, I'm going to go
that
here.
goal,
Yeah, and you did,
so
and you
important.
studied English literature at Oxford, which is one of the most incredible achievements. Like, not many people would say, I'm going to go to Oxford and actually do it. And I know that you started writing your book when within the hospital, behind the curtain.
Behind the curtain.
So can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so the book came about during an admission when I was in hospital during COVID. Mm-hmm. It was obviously a time that a lot of people will remember and be able to relate to, where you couldn't have any visitors in hospital. Mm-hmm. So I was there on my own for around a month. And I just read Adam Kay's This Is Going to Hurt, which your listeners might be aware of, is a memoir written by a junior doctor about his experience of life as a doctor working in the NHS. And I read this book and I thought, there has to be a patient reply to this. And I am the expert patient. I feel I've seen it all. I still had a bit more coming for me, which I didn't realise at that stage. But I felt like my response to Adam Kay, he says, this is going to hurt. And I said, it did hurt. It hurt a lot. And I messaged my mum and I said, I'm going to write a book. And I even have the title. It's Be Patient. And as you say, there was this, I guess manifesting. I felt like this experience needed to go into something, and it was going to be this book. So I then very excitingly went on to get the publishing deal for Be Patient. I then had to write the book, and I was very much living out my chapters as I was still writing this. At times in Germany, I was living on 24-hour oxygen. Mm-hmm. I couldn't physically move from the bed at times, but was still trying to finish this memoir. For me, it was a goal, a distraction again, outside of the kind of horribleness of what I was going through. But it was also extremely cathartic to put those thoughts and feelings down on the page. And to anyone who follows my Instagram, this story it's not the same as my Instagram chapters. It's the story that leads up to the Instagram, really, the story behind the curtain before I began to share on social media. So it's full of untold stories and anecdotes. There is also a lot of humour to be had in patient life. Like, at times you do just have to laugh. There's a dark humour that comes with that. And laughter is a coping mechanism. Laughter, I say, is the best medicine of all. So there are funny moments in this. There are heartbreaking moments. There are stories of my family and our relationships and how that all plays out around the hospital bed. There are stories about navigating chronic illness in a relationship. I really delve into all the different aspects of patient life. And what I have tried to achieve with Be Patient is bringing in the human beings at the centre of our system. So often, I think in the media, patients are reduced to statistics. And what I wanted to do was cover this entire patient experience. The cleaners, the receptionists, the physios, the doctors, the nurses, the patients, the families. I wanted to bring everyone that makes up our system into this book. And what's been incredible has been the response to that, not only from patients who say that it's empowering, as you say with the survival tips, it's giving them the tips to navigate this journey, but also from medical staff who are saying it's actually given them a new perspective on thinking about that notion that they come into work and they stand at your bed for 5 minutes on the morning ward round. And if you think about the sort of the media and the way that junior doctors are, fighting for better working conditions, which I'm totally on board with, where does that leave the patient? They're there for that 5 minutes maybe, working in that condition, but at the end of the day, they can leave and go home. As a patient, you are stuck in that bed. So if your bed is surrounded by the moat of bedpans, if there are bedpans by the sink when you go to the toilet, if there are people climbing in your bed in the middle of the night, you can't escape. And I think that's what this has also kind of been illuminating for medical staff to see, is just giving them that fresh perspective on actually thinking about the patient as that human being behind the hospital curtain. And one of my big goals with the book now is to get the patient perspective on the medical curriculum, because as it stands, which is so relevant to the work you're doing with women in healthcare, I have gone through the various different reading lists for medical schools, and as far as I can see and I'm aware, there is no female patient perspective of our NHS on those reading lists. there are perspectives of doctors or doctors who are maybe patients as well. But that's a very different scenario to purely being a patient and being a female patient in our system.
Yeah.
And there are so many stories of women out there in these female, as we've said, experiences that I truly believe could change attitudes in medical education if medics and staff were to read those narratives as part of their training. I think it's as important as the scientific knowledge is actually that human emotional side of the people they're interacting with.
I think that's so, I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, we've spoken about before that women are more complex in the sense from a medical standpoint because there's not enough clinical trials which are done on women.
Yeah.
And this, I believe, is because women's hormones fluctuate from a day-to-day perspective. For the women that I've spoken to on this podcast before who suffer with, you know, before the age of 35, one of my guests had to have a hysterectomy. And to deal with the loss of, you know, not having children when you've always wanted children and things like that. But for these complex cases not to be, I guess, I don't know if it's research or it's the empathy or it's just something needs to change.
Massively so. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And platforms like your podcast, I believe story sharing is how we do that. Stories have the power to change the world. I've seen that through sharing my own and Be Patient, through my own social media pages, and through the stories I've heard from other women. And no doubt, as you say, the guests you're having on your podcast now, those stories are what resonate. Those stories are what actually like hit you to the core and make you realize that this is an issue that really needs to be dealt with. And I think those stories are what need to be at the centre of these policy-making, decision-making processes, that the patient actually, as it stands in the female patient voice, they're not being listened to in those rooms. And that's the voice that needs to get out there.
And I think, you know, we spoke about the support, your support network, and how much of a incredible kind of rock your mother has been to you. I want to say that some people might not have that.
Yeah,
and the hope, and your book has even given me so much hope with my medical journey. There's some things that I'm going through which are you know, still undiagnosed.
Yeah.
But for some people, they might have given up in the sense of, okay, this is too complex. I'm being told it's in my head.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's true. And I kind of want, you know, from what I want from my podcast, as well as when people go out and buy or read your book, is carry on, you know, be your own advocate. If you've got a support network, amazing. If you don't, you can be your own cheerleader. Yeah,
and I think it's something we've discussed previously, this concept of acceptance.
Yeah.
My mum was, I fundamentally say, without realising it, what my mum did and has done throughout the years is she has coached me through this process. And I think coaching is a really interesting sort of way of looking at it, and it's something that I actually subsequently I went on to study for a coaching qualification at Cambridge, because that is something that I now want to do to help patients moving forward. I feel that coaching is this sort of goal orientated approach that we can apply to our health, that patients are so often told that they need to deal with their stress and go for counselling and therapy, when actually they've got a physical problem that they are having to learn how to navigate a system. And as you say, not everybody has that person in their life who can provide that. But I think that coaching offers a way to allow you to learn those skills to keep moving forward on that journey. And that's something that I'm looking to develop in the new year. But as you say, if you don't have that person in your life, I hope that with these platforms, with hearing other patients' stories and engaging with other patient voices and using these patient survival tips, the biggest message, which is what you're saying, is if something doesn't feel right, even if a medical professional is telling you that, you don't have to accept it. And I would say, in that sense, you can always seek another medical opinion. And my mum was or is so wise in the advice that she's given me over the years. Her lines were, There is a reason for everything, which I'd say is something for patients to keep in their mind. Giving up is never an option. And her third one was one person is all it takes. And I was incredibly lucky to have that one person as my mum. But for somebody else, that might be your friend, that might be your sister, that might be a member of staff that you find along the way who just happens to take that little bit of extra interest in your case. Whoever that is, and whoever can be that voice and that advocate for you, could end up being that tiny bit of hope that you can hold on to. And I think you don't know necessarily where you're going to find that, and you don't know when they're going to appear. But for me, along the journey, hope lay in people.
Yeah.
And it wasn't always the person that you necessarily expected. And I think also one thing that patients can do is, if you've got someone in your life who really cares about you, sometimes they'll want to help, but they don't necessarily know how. They don't know what you need from them. And I think actually telling them, saying, do you know what? I'm not in a position to maybe research this right now, but if you could do that little bit of research for me,